Many of you have probably heard of the RNA world hypothesis, an idea about how life may have arisen on the early Earth. But even if you haven't, this video is for you. This video is for everybody, whether you are a science major or a layperson who is just interested in learning a little more about science. The first question that a lot of you are probably asking is, what is RNA? Before we get to that, however, let's take a look at some other molecules that play important roles in the cell. Proteins are the basic worker units of the cell. They do most of the day-to-day jobs, and often they are used to provide structural support for the cell. DNA is an interesting little piece of machinery. This is probably the most sophisticated molecule in the universe. Its main job is to store genetic information, such as blueprints for making proteins. Some people have compared it to a library, but I think a better analogy would be a computer. RNA, a molecule that is similar to DNA in many ways, has been found to have some interesting properties. Not only can it store genetic information like DNA, it can also perform catalytic activities, similar to the way that proteins do. In addition to these jobs, RNA does other important jobs in the cell as well. There are other molecules in the cell that play important roles too, such as carbohydrates and lipids, but for this video, our main focus is going to be on just these three. Because RNA is capable of performing these various tasks, it has been speculated that a self-reproducing RNA molecule might be possible. Basically, the idea is that it might be possible to construct a strand of RNA that can make copies of itself. Perhaps this is how life first got started. It has been speculated that an RNA molecule could go on to evolve into the first simple single-celled organisms, gradually becoming more and more complex over millions of years. In a nutshell, what the RNA world hypothesis says is that a self-reproducing RNA molecule arose out of the primordial soup, and gradually these RNA molecules became more and more complex thanks to mutation and natural selection, until the descendants of this original RNA molecule were able to finally evolve into the first living cell. There are three obvious questions that arise about this hypothetical RNA molecule, as well as other obvious and not so obvious questions. Can it exist? Can it arise? And can it evolve? Can it exist? The question of whether or not an RNA molecule like this could ever exist is simple. Can an RNA molecule ever exist in the physical world that can truly self-reproduce? Or is this merely an interesting idea with no counterpart in reality? So far, no one has ever been able to create a self-reproducing molecule like this, in a laboratory or anywhere else for that matter, and no one has ever seen one in nature. So far, the idea of a self-reproducing molecule is just an idea. Can it arise? Even if a self-reproducing molecule could be made, the question is, can it arise naturally under the right conditions? No one has ever been able to create a self-reproducing molecule in the laboratory, even with all of our advanced technology, let alone observed one to arise in any sort of chemical soup. Also, a self-reproducing molecule would probably have a lot of jobs to do all at once, and as a result, could very well be so sophisticated and complex that the odds of one forming by chance could turn out to be mathematically impossible. Now, let's say that it were possible to create a self-reproducing RNA molecule in the laboratory. Would this molecule ever be able to gradually progress to become a living cell? There is no guarantee that it could progress like this. Also, Scientists are increasingly finding that the simplest living cell that could ever exist would need at least a few hundred genes just to survive and reproduce. They are finding that it is impossible to go any lower than that. This is a huge problem for the claim that a self-reproducing molecule is even possible, let alone the idea that life could have risen from these speculative processes. So the question remains, where is the solid scientific evidence? Basically, there isn't any. RNA molecules do a lot of jobs in the cell, and that is what is generally offered up as evidence that living cells descended from RNA molecules. While the RNA world is an interesting idea, the evidence to back it up is feeble at best. It has been claimed that perhaps there was an RNA molecule that arose on the early Earth, was capable of self-replicating, and ultimately became the ancestor of those first living cells. This is an interesting idea, but no self-replicating molecule has ever been found, despite many of the world's top minds spending their careers trying to find or build one. As a science major, I view the RNA world hypothesis as a very interesting idea, but I also recognize that there is no real substance to back it up. One of the tests of a good scientific hypothesis is whether or not it can be falsified in a laboratory. With the RNA world hypothesis, there is nothing that can really be tested like this. It is speculation about an imaginary molecule that might have somehow existed. In reality, this means that the RNA world is not even a scientific hypothesis. Unfortunately, I can't put a somehow in a test tube. That doesn't mean that I am saying that we throw out the baby with the bathwater. Speculation can lead to very important research, and research in this area might help us to learn more about how RNA works. But let's not wander into the realm of pseudoscience by pretending that this idea is more than it is. My name is Greg, I am a biotech major, and thank you for watching my video.